Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1, action.
Assume nothing.
Brash, bald-faced blasphemy.
Question everything.
I find it extremely hard to imagine.
Open your eyes.
It is quite all right to be an atheist.
The fastest growing group of people in the country has been measured as being those who have no belief or who are atheists.
You don't have to be apologetic or quiet about it.
Challenge the opposition.
You see religion on 100 fronts losing the argument.
And start thinking. This is The Thinking Atheist Worldwide.
The subject of our broadcast today was no stranger to argument, right? Madalyn Murray O'Hair. Well, the Great Courses Plus, today's show sponsor, has a whole series called Argumentation, the study of effective reasoning. It's taught by Dr. David Zarefsky, who's a professor of communication studies at Northeastern University. He's authored several books. He's a decades-long expert in effective and ineffective communication and public debate. If you're addressing a position beyond the tactics of the street epistemologist, you're into a more structured debate, this is a lecture series that has a lot of interesting stuff to consider. How you build your case, how to approach the defensive posture, the logician versus the rhetorician, revealing logical fallacies. It's a thick course loaded with stuff to chew on, and it's just one of over 8,000 courses you can enjoy at the Great Courses Plus on subjects ranging from car repair to religion to the arts to geography to how to play a better game of chess. Stream to your computer, tablet, or smartphone and broaden your knowledge. Right now, my listeners can watch Argumentation, the study of effective reasoning, and any other course with a free trial when you sign up for the Great Courses Plus through my special URL. Go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/Seth. Try it today. You're going to love it. thegreatcoursesplus.com/Seth. This broadcast releasing on the 18th of April. The patrons, of course, get it a day early. But the truth is, I'm actually recording a good portion of the broadcast well before that. For me, it is the 13th. It is Thursday. And the reason I'm doing the show early is because tomorrow for me, I'm going in for surgery. I've got an old nagging tennis injury, been bugging me for a couple of years. Finally got the MRI, shows a torn tendon. So they're going to go in tomorrow and they're going to sew it up. And I don't know, they remove scar tissue. And I've been watching YouTube videos of the procedure all day yesterday. I mean, one after the other. And I'm not scared of surgery. I'm more fascinated than anything. I mean, yeah, I don't want to go in and have my elbow opened up necessarily. It's not like I'm looking forward to it, but I'm just fascinated. And they go in and they do all this stuff, and the procedure takes like 15, 20 minutes. And then it's 10 days in a sling and a few months of physical therapy. But now seemed like the right time to do it because, May I'm going to be doing a 5 or 6 city tour. I'm doing New Orleans and Memphis, Jackson, Springfield, Fort Smith. That's the 3rd week in May. In June, going to Toronto. I've got some more events coming up in July. So before I'm lugging bags, luggage, camera gear, whatever, through airports and having to navigate all that, I thought this is probably the best time to do it. So just picture me as you're listening to the conversation. I'm probably vegetating on a couch, right arm in a sling, jacked up on hydrocodone. Yeah. Whee! I have no idea what that's going to be like. But I'm so glad you're listening to the broadcast. It's a conversation that I really felt like we should have this month because Netflix just released a film called The Most Hated Woman in America. And this is supposedly a profile of the late atheist activist Madalyn Murray O'Hair, once called the most hated woman in America. And some would say deservedly so. I remember back when I was a believer, I was a kid, my parents would talk about Madalyn Murray O'Hair, and they just loathed her. They thought she was an agent of Satan himself. They saw only misery and anger in her life and words, and nobody wants to be like her. Why would you want to live a life like her? Why would you ever want to align with her? I think Mom actually said something like that to me after I was an atheist and had told her so. And she's like, fine, if you want to align yourself with someone like that, go ahead. And I can understand the concern because even now as an atheist, I look at the life and legacy of Madalyn Murray O'Hair and I'm in conflict over it. I mean, I used to be really put off by her. Now I see her in more three dimensions. I see her as a complex, often conflicted, very flawed character, but also an important one, someone who was part of some very necessary and often very unpleasant conversations in a time when, even much more than today, Christianity was flexing its muscle everywhere, and she went in and fought the unpopular battle. And she said the stuff that needed to be said, and she was often booed and hissed, and she was given death threats and whatnot. Her life is a fascinating story, as is her death, and she was horribly murdered, and we'll get into that story. And so when Netflix produces a film about Madalyn Murray O'Hair, and Netflix quite often produces really quality content. I mean, they've come up with so many great series and so much good programming that's just so well done. I was excited. I was like, wow, it's finally time someone translated Madalyn Murray O'Hair's story, warts and all, to the screen, all right? And so I watched the film. I watched it 2 days ago, and I was hugely disappointed. I was like watching a bad Lifetime movie. I love Melissa Leo, who was fantastic in the film Red State. She played LBJ's wife in All the Way, which was an HBO profile of Lyndon Johnson. Just amazing. She's an amazing actor. And in this film, she was not. It was just ham-handed, and I felt like I was watching a high school play. And I was so disappointed. What an opportunity lost. And then I read a review which was posited by Frank Zindler, a longtime associate of American Atheists, somebody who knew Madalyn Murray O'Hair personally. And he saw the film, and he wrote a review which was talking about all of the inaccuracies and all the things they got wrong. And they just missed this opportunity, and they just fictionalized so much stuff, more so than you might even expect. And so I thought, let's talk about the film. And more importantly, let's talk about the true life and legacy of Madalyn Murray O'Hair with someone who knew her. And my conversation with Frank Zindler is going to constitute the majority of this broadcast. Madalyn Murray O'Hair was born April the 13th, 1919 in Pittsburgh. Ironically, as an infant, she was baptized into the Presbyterian Church. Now, obviously, that didn't take. She served in the Women's Army Corps in the field of cryptography. Her birth name, Madalyn Mays. She divorced her first husband, and she took the last name of William Murray. This is a man she had a relationship with, but who remained married to another woman, a woman he would not divorce. She got her degree in law from the South Texas College of Law, which, as I understand it, is an unaccredited university. She failed the bar exam. She never actually practiced the law in her own life. She had stated she'd worked for 17 years as a psychiatric social worker, including a stint as a supervisor at the Baltimore Public Welfare Department. In 1964, she married a U.S. Marine named Richard O'Hair. That ultimately ended in separation but not divorce. But this is how she became known as Madalyn Murray O'Hair. She had two sons, William, or Bill, and John. In 1960, Madalyn was angry that her son William was being required to participate in the Lord's Prayer and Bible readings at Baltimore public schools, and so she filed a lawsuit. The case ended up at the Supreme Court in 1963. It was a consolidation with a famous case, the Abington School District versus Shemp, Ellery Shemp. And the court voted in Shemp's favor, 8-1, to abolish mandatory Bible verse readings in public schools in the United States. And in her opening statement, which was given February the 27th, 1963, Madalyn Murray said this before the court, and I quote, "Your petitioners are atheists, and they define their beliefs as follows. An atheist loves his fellow man instead of God. An atheist believes that heaven is something for which we should work now, here on earth, for all men together to enjoy. An atheist believes that he can get no help through prayer, but that he must find in himself the inner conviction and strength to meet life, to grapple with it, to subdue it, and enjoy it. An atheist believes that only in a knowledge of himself and a knowledge of his fellow man can he find the understanding that will help to a life of fulfillment. He seeks to know himself and his fellow man rather than to know a God. An atheist believes that a hospital should be built instead of a church. An atheist believes that a deed must be done instead of a prayer said. An atheist strives for involvement in life and not escape into death. He wants disease conquered, poverty vanquished, war eliminated. He wants man to understand and love man. He wants an ethical way of life. He believes that we cannot rely on a God or channel action into prayer, nor hope for an end of troubles in a hereafter. He believes that we are our brother's keepers, and are keepers of our own lives, that we are responsible persons, and the job is here, and the time is now. Another lawsuit followed. Madalyn Murray O'Hair sued NASA in regard to the reading of Genesis by the crew of Apollo 8. She lost that lawsuit. She became a known television personality. I believe she was the first guest ever on the Phil Donahue Show, appearing for the first time in 1967. Here's a 1970 clip from the Donahue Show as she debated a gentleman named Reverend Bob Harrington, known as the chaplain of Bourbon Street. They were taking questions from the audience and asking whether or not they felt like Madalyn could be redeemed. And there was a woman in the audience who said no, like Madalyn was destined for hell. And so they brought the microphone to this woman and had her speak on television. I'll play you this exchange. It runs about 3 minutes.
Let me ask you, do you believe that Madalyn Murray O'Hair could be saved?
Yes.
Do you believe it?
How many? Raise your hand.
Do you believe it? How many believe she could?
How many think it's too late?
How many think she's gone too far? Raise your hand.
How many of you people really think that what I do or what I think is in your hands? How many of you repudiate personal freedom and my individual choice?
We don't repudiate that.
Would you stand for just a second?
Whatsoever.
Hold it. You'll stand so they can see. Why do you think it's too late?
Well, just the things she has said so many times against the Word and against the Holy Spirit. And
yeah, but wouldn't the Holy Spirit forgive her?
Well, let me put it this way. If she isn't saved before she dies, I would like to have it published of how she dies.
Why?
Because I believe if she isn't, well, doped up, like people die. Right. I believe if she dies and if she is in her senses and rational, I believe that she will die such miserable death that it would convince all those that are following her that she was wrong.
Do you know how atheists have died? Because we have all kind of material on this. Atheists die like every other person in the world dies, as human beings, nothing else.
To make her suffer?
Of course, she wants me to suffer.
Bob Ingersoll is the one you have in mind.
That's who I was thinking.
Robert Ingersoll died of a heart attack at the foot of the stairs in his dining room, and his granddaughter, Eva Ingersoll, belongs to my organization.
But who causes these?
There are as many lies about him as about me.
Does God cause these painful deaths?
Sure he does.
I think if a person's not saved, and when they die, if they're rational, they're going to know where they're going.
Yeah.
According to your doctor.
Yeah. Well, okay. You think she's going to hell then?
I don't know. I would like to have faith to believe that she could be saved. I say this, if she is ever saved,
I don't want to be saved. I'm not interested in your ideas.
Can I come in the audience and ask a question?
Sure.
Let's not turn it into a revival meeting.
What do you have? You don't have anything to revive. I want to get you saved first, see. Hey, listen.
We're continuing to live, you see. And as I said yesterday, many of you people are dead up there.
Yeah.
So you got a hard job trying to get something going to waken them up to anything.
What do you have against God?
First,
why does he bug you?
Well, first off, there isn't any. And second off, the idea which you invented has caused more misery to every human being in all ages of history than any other single idea.
Listen, Madalyn.
Even war hasn't caused.
If there were not a God, you'd got to get a new gimmick. See, there has to be a God for there to be a Madalyn Murray.
What do you mean?
Because you wouldn't create any attention at all if you didn't have someone to be against.
Really, people invented the idea of God somewhere along the line, and actually most of the invention has been to keep the common people happy. so that you find the kings and the rulers, when this God idea first came into existence, saying to people, suffer in poverty, because the poor will always be with us, and only the poor in spirit and the poor in finances will get into heaven. Take your lot now and let us live high off the hog. And what this was a wedding of authority and religion in order to subjugate masses of people.
So you can get a lot of support from
people are breaking away from
a lot of
now.
Christians
This is
will
why
support
religion
that,
is
Madalyn.
in trouble.
Phil Donahue himself was featured in the documentary film Godless in America, which released in 2006, and he commented on his own experience with Madalyn Murray O'Hair.
Madalyn could be very, very unpleasant and sarcastic. Almighty God, she pronounced God, God. You go ahead and pray, and she'd laugh at people who prayed.
You're going to spend your whole life preparing to meet the Lord. Boy, you folks are crazy as hell.
And she seemed to get the biggest kick out of the Christians who called the program and wished that God would damn her in hell forever in boiling oil. That just thrilled her. That was a success. That was her proof that religion was a form of mental illness.
In 1965, Madalyn was interviewed by Playboy magazine. She called religion a crutch and, quote, an irrational reliance on superstitions and supernatural nonsense. It was 1963 when she founded American Atheists, and she was that organization's primary face throughout the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. She and the organization were at the point position on many lawsuits over church-state violations. She was a radio and television personality. It was in 1980 that her oldest son, William, became a Christian. Bill was essentially cut off from his mother. He was obviously lauded and applauded by churches and religious organizations across the country over the course of decades. Bill wrote a book called My Life Without God. In 2012, he appeared on the Mike Huckabee show on Fox News to talk about his mother.
When you became a Christian, your mother wasn't exactly happy about it. It wasn't like she said, oh, I want to come to your baptism. In fact, there's a statement, we're going to put it up on the screen. It's just, it's shocking. And it's got to be hurtful, but it's this her statement that she made about you. And let's get it on the screen because I want our audience to see it. It says, one could call this when she disowned you, could call this a postnatal abortion on the part of a mother. I repudiate him, speaking of you, I repudiate him entirely and completely for now and all times. He is beyond human forgiveness. That had to have hurt coming from your own mother.
Well, Governor, oddly, it didn't hurt that much because of how dysfunctional the home was that I was raised in and the number of times where I had done something that was perhaps wrong in her eyes as a child when she had looked at me and said, I wished abortion would have been legal when I was carrying.
She's told you that to your face.
She told me that to my face when I was younger. So this was nothing more than you know, a continuation of that. But that is the type of home where the only thing that's important are those material things or material philosophies or government or statism or whatever. When only those things are important to you, the feelings of people, of individuals, aren't that important.
August 27th, 1995. Madalyn Murray O'Hair, her son John, and her granddaughter Robin suddenly disappeared. The door to the office of American Atheist had a note tacked to it stating, quote, the Murray O'Hair family has been called out of town on an emergency basis. At her home, it appeared the family had left without prepping or packing anything. Medications were left behind, food on the table, the family dogs abandoned. Over the course of several weeks, phone calls were made by the three, saying that they were on business, that nothing was wrong, but it was reported that their disposition on those phone calls was unconvincing. Something was perceived to be wrong. John ordered $600,000 worth of gold coins from a jeweler in San Antonio and took delivery of $500,000 worth of them. The other $100,000 were never received. After the 28th of September, 1995, more than a month after their disappearance, the three were not heard from again. In January of 2001, this is 6 years later, David Waters, a former employee of American Atheists, confessed to the kidnapping, extortion, and murder of the Murray family. All three were strangled, stuffed in barrels, the bodies driven back to Austin. Waters' ex-girlfriend testified against him. There were actually three involved in the kidnapping. This story profiled to a degree in the Netflix film. And I'm going to speak on the broadcast more about the incident, what happened, how they were discovered, and the charge by many that Madalyn Murray O'Hair only had access to all of this money in the first place because she had been embezzling or at least using her activism to get rich. We're going to talk about that. It's a complex story about a complex person, and in my opinion, an opportunity missed, hugely missed, by Netflix. This broadcast is going to hopefully be a more detailed, more in-depth, more fair, and more accurate profile, for better and for worse, of Madalyn Murray O'Hair. This is Madalyn Murray O'Hair speaking at UCLA in February of 1972, telling the story of when she realized for the first time that she was an atheist.
I was born and reared in the Presbyterian faith, so to speak. At one time in America, women had to take the religions of their husband. And my mother, who was a Lutheran, married a Presbyterian. She was married to him for 50 years. And from the moment, the day of their marriage, she was required by the custom of those times to attend the Presbyterian church because that was the faith of her husband. And the children were brought up in the Presbyterian faith. This was my older brother and myself. However, of course, we never lost light of the fact that my mother was a Lutheran. So no matter what I heard about in the Presbyterian church, she would always slyly intimate that, of course, they were, after all, Presbyterians, and she was a Lutheran, which was the one true faith. So I have the background of being a product of a white upper-middle-class Protestant home. And at about the age of 13, I was bored one weekend, and I picked up a dictionary to start to read it. And what I would do was get a word and read the meaning of the word and then look up the meaning of every word that was given in the meaning of that word. And I kept that up for 5 or 6 or 7 hours on Friday afternoon and evening, and I got fed up with that, so I went and got the Bible and I read it from cover to cover one weekend. Do it. It is a quick lesson in atheism. The Bible is so incredible and so heinous, so full of hate and vindictiveness. It is so bad that you will repudiate it immediately. People say to me that I'm trying to get the Bible and prayer out of public schools. Like hell I am. I'm against religious ceremonies in public schools, and I will continue to be so. But the Bible, the more people who read it, the more people will be atheistic. And I think that it should be required reading as an educational course, and to have it inspected in all schools from the 5th grade on up. So I became an atheist then. I didn't even know the meaning of the word, and I had to try to find out what I was. I didn't know what it was. And as I said, I was good white upper-middle-class Protestant, and there were no books in any library, public library, or even university library that I went to on atheism. I didn't know that there was anybody else in the world who had rejected this bullshit but me. I finally got into the Army. I was a commissioned officer in the Army and was serving in France when I got into a fight with a group of other Army officers, and a woman Army officer, a captain who was a medical doctor, looked at me and said, "Why, you're nothing but a goddamn atheist. That's what you are." So I rushed over to the French library and looked up the word atheist, and hallelujah, that's what I was. So I was 23 years old before I even found out what my proper appellation was.
Let me play one more recording for you. This is an old exchange between Madalyn Murray O'Hair and William F. Buckley, who was a famous American conservative author and commentator. He was founder of the National Review, and he hosted a television show called Firing Line. They spoke on this broadcast April 22nd, 1971, on the subject of prayer in schools.
In a free society, people ought to be permitted to do what they want to do and to arrange their institutions the way they want to arrange their institutions, subject to the inalienable rights of the minority. Now, the inalienable rights of the minority are very carefully specified by the Constitution of the United States. What you are engaged in is a fanatic extension of the establishment of religion to the point where you say a Christmas tree is a threat to establish religion. And
well, I saw that cartoon in your
extension.
magazine, but of course I haven't fought that. However, I
haven't seen it, but
will be happy to get involved in that at a later date. What we're talking about is this. If there is nothing in the school, if there is no religious ceremony, then this mitigates against no one. It assists me none at all. It assists all atheists none at all. But it also does not assist any kind of religious organization.
But suppose people want that.
They can pray at home. They can pray silently in the corridors. They can pray. What you're saying is that you want to
study French at home too.
No, you want to exercise your insanity in public. And you want everybody who is a captive audience in that public to participate in it by listening to you do it. Now, you completely ignore the admonitions of Jesus Christ, and you presume to be a Christian. He said, do not pray in public. And this was quite specific. And you know this. He said this on the Sermon on the Mount, and if you take...
Which was done in private? I know that you are said to have read the entire Bible at age 13. On the Mount, you know. I know that you're said to have read the entire Bible through at age 13 over the course of one weekend. I respectfully point out that was quite a while ago.
Yes. And, now, your presumption then is that I have not read it or studied it since?
My presumption is that if you can't quote the First Amendment of the Constitution, it's also possible that you don't completely understand the Bible. Or let's put it another way: there are people who there are people who understand the Bible and have made it their life study, who are not one of whom that I know of agrees with you. That public prayer.
Well, I would suspect that no persons with whom you are in Congress would accept my interpretation of the Bible.
I said to anybody.
Yes.
Your point of view is eccentric.
No, my point of view is not eccentric. My point of view has been suppressed, which is different entirely.
Exchanges like these are really the reason that I find the reality of Madalyn Murray O'Hair so much more compelling than the fictional Netflix version of Madalyn Murray O'Hair. But let's talk more about the film with someone who can speak to the authenticity of the film. Joining me on the broadcast is Frank Zindler. Frank knew Madalyn Murray O'Hair personally, worked alongside her in the early days of American Atheist. He was at one point acting president of American Atheist, and he is the current editor of American Atheist Press, as well as an author in his own right. His books include The Jesus the Jews Never Knew and Through Atheist Eyes, Scenes from a World That Won't Reason. And there are 2 volumes of that book. Frank Zindler joins me here. It's great to have you, my friend.
Thank you, Seth. It's an honor to do a program with you.
Did you take the reins at American Atheist after Madalyn Murray O'Hair? When did your tenure begin and end there?
No. I became interim president when Ellen Johnson left the office in 2008. She had assumed the office at the end of 1995. Remember, Madalyn and John and Robin disappeared at the end of September of 1995.
Did you see the Netflix film, The Most Hated Woman in America?
Yes, and I'm still trying to get my blood pressure down.
That's a loaded question. I knew the answer because that's the reason we're speaking today. I just caught it myself, right, a couple of days ago. And I think I disliked it for different reasons. Obviously, I didn't know Madalyn Murray O'Hair personally. I just felt it was a poorly made film. It was everybody was kind of a cardboard cutout. I felt like in some ways, I said earlier, like I was watching a high school play. And I thought, what a compelling story that should have been told compellingly. And this certainly was not. What was your take?
Well, I certainly agree with that. As you say, they were cut-out characters, although what bothered me more than that was that at least one of the characters, Roy Collier, was really a composite of 2 important players. He was a composite of Don Sanders, the vice president of American Atheists, and independently the president of American Gay Atheists, and Orrin Spike Tyson, who became the office manager when the board of directors took control of our headquarters in Austin. And so by conflating those 2 people, this resulted in wild anachronisms and things that just simply never happened.
You expect to a degree a Hollywoodization of it. They're going to get some stuff wrong, but It just seems so ham-handed, just like they weren't interested in accuracy. And the real story of Madalyn Murray O'Hair is so much more compelling and interesting, is it not?
Exactly. They did not do any research that I could imagine, because if they had, even allowing for artistic license, quote unquote, they could not have produced a film like the one that we're talking about. Basically, they looked at the most scurrilous reports that had been available in the popular media, including a vicious rumor that goes back to probably 1993 that was spread by some rival free thought groups and several independent people who had nothing to do with any group. The rumor that Madalyn was the leader of a cult, that was the term they used, and that she had bilked her credulous followers out of literally millions of dollars, and that she had stashed all these millions in offshore accounts.
And then it's presented that David Waters, the man who ultimately killed her, was embezzling money from the organization because there was all this money to embezzle, right?
What happened, if I can tell a little bit in detail of the story, she had hired David Waters not to be office manager, as the movie says, but simply as a factotum. He was a guy who could do most anything. He was very, very talented, very bright, and he was applying for work of any kind, whatever he could do, and we needed help with the printing press, we needed help with computers, we needed help with the office, and all kinds of things, and Waters could do all of that. And among the things that he could do was print up a false resume. Madalyn usually was very good at checking credentials, but Waters came at a crucial time, and she didn't have time to check on all of these things. And so she did not know that he already had served time in prison for murder. He had killed his first person at the age of 16. But he was really good at forging a resume. And so he became part of the staff. And by the way, a very highly valued member of the staff very, very quickly. If the printing press broke down, he could repair it and all this sort of thing. So the time came then when Madalyn, John, and in the film, he's referred to by his middle name, Garth, and it is true. That's one of the few things in the film that have verisimilitude. He usually did, among intimates, he was always called Garth. And Robin, they had to go to San Diego for a trial in federal court. And I and my wife, who we were both on the board of directors at the time, and I think just about all the members of the board of directors were at that trial in San Diego. And it was expected that the trial would last several weeks. It was a very complicated case. So normally, in the absence of the family, Don Sanders would have been placed as office manager in their absence. However, Don had AIDS, and he was in crisis at that moment, and he could not do anything. And so, as an emergency measure, Madalyn put David Waters in control as temporary office manager. The trial ended early, and everybody came home. I came home to Ohio. Madalyn, Garth, and Robin came back to Austin, Texas. They got to the Atheist Center, and it was closed up. It was locked. Lights were out. And they went in, and things just didn't look right. They called Spike Tyson to say, "What's going on?" And he said, "Well, David Waters laid us all off." And so what had happened, Madalyn could see that things had been ransacked. The safe was open. Waters had stolen several $100,000 of bonds. He had gotten into the computers. He closed out all of the local bank accounts, but there was one account that he could not crack. And this was the account in New Zealand of our trust fund, which had exactly $1 million in it. He had no way of knowing, because he came on board late in history, he had no way of knowing that that was a trust fund. that we had a drive for 5 years to try to raise $1 million so that we could run the daily affairs of the office on the earnings of the $1 million trust fund. For 5 years, ending about, 10 months or so before he came on board, in every monthly issue of the Insider's newsletter, we had a thermometer graph showing how high the money was going and how close we were getting to the $1 million mark. But that had ended successfully, as I say, about 10 months before he came on board, so there was no longer any publicity about it. While we had the account in an American bank while we were raising the funds, by the time we had the $1 million, we, for specific reasons I can't remember anymore other than the general statement that the earnings were better and safer in New Zealand, the board of directors moved the bank account, the trust fund, to this bank in New Zealand. But now, backing up to Waters, he came across that account and he couldn't crack into it because it required an actual signature of an officer, and it had to be transacted through a connecting bank in New Jersey. So as far as Waters was concerned, this was the smoking gun. This was the validation of all those rumors that she had millions stashed in offshore accounts. He probably assumed that there would be another set of books somewhere that would, show where she had stashed the rest of the money. And in the film, they take that rumor that she had stashed this in offshore accounts, and they actually have Madalyn kind of tipsy, showing Waters this second set of books. I mean, this is absolutely outrageous. It is libel of the worst kind. It's character assassination.
Let me stop you there for just a second, Frank. There's a scene in the film, and I'm going to come back to David Waters and his, I guess, is this his attempt to assassinate her character before he assassinates her literally, kind of thing? I'm going to come back to that. But there's a scene in the film right at the beginning of her activism when the mail starts coming in, most of it hate mail, but lo and behold, there is a letter of support, and in that letter is a $100 bill. Now, she didn't exactly cackle and twirl her mustache when the money was located, but the film insinuates, overtly tells you that, this could be lucrative, and they sort of paint her as someone who at the very outset thought, hey, activism is good business, which is why she did what she did, an ulterior motive kind of thing. You want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. It is true that various people, including some old-timers that I knew in the past who are now dead, had sent her money, but the circumstances, you have to understand, she had been, and her family had been driven from their home in Baltimore. The police had invaded the house, attacked her father and mother, broke her wrists, ended her musical career as a concert-quality pianist. And she was desperate. She could not get a job. She was blackballed everywhere. It was absolutely impossible for her to find work. And she had previously worked, the film was correct, she had worked at several different types of jobs. But she then, after the court case, she no longer could be employed anywhere. And so it was literally a lifesaver, I guess, that these people who were sending her this money. The point I want to make about that is that at no point was there so much money coming in through the whole history of the organization. At no point was there so much money coming in that anybody could stash $1 million, let alone millions of dollars, in offshore accounts. I mean, it's just crazy. So, yeah, they have her thinking, oh boy, this is a great way to make a living. But it was at that point the only way she could make a living.
Let's talk about how Frank Zindler knows Madalyn Murray O'Hair personally. What was your first introduction and the context of that relationship?
I was a professor in the State University of New York at the time. This was 1976. And she came to New York City to try to recruit people from the state of New York to set up local chapters of American Atheists. I had long read about Madalyn O'Hair ever since 1963 with the Supreme Court decision that outlawed forced prayer and Bible reading in the public schools. But the media made it impossible for anybody to know where she lived or how you could communicate with her. It was a complete blackout on any communication possibilities. And so here she was. There was a very small ad in the Schenectady, New York newspaper that said she was going to be in New York City at such and such a place. It was a paid advertisement. And so I and some friends went down, and I met her, and John was just beginning his activist career. And so I was extremely impressed with what she was saying. And she was very gracious as we talked privately after the public meeting, and we set up a chapter of her group in Schenectady, New York. But shortly after that, I became much more involved by virtue of being in that chapter, an officer in that chapter, and they had an annual meeting, and my wife and I went to that annual meeting. I forget what city it was in. And at that point, we just kind of joined forces completely. I was so moved by her dedication and what she had done and what she was trying to do that I know this sounds corny, and I a little bit blush to say this, but quite truly, at that point, I dedicated my life to the organization. Not specifically to Madalyn, but to the organization, and I'm still in it. Anne was almost as enthusiastic. She was somewhat less emotional than I.
Wait, she was less emotional?
Yeah.
Well, perhaps less emotional, but more volatile. Perhaps we might say that.
I mean my wife Anne was less emotional than I.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was thinking of Madalyn. I was like, oh, yeah.
Okay, I must have elided something there.
No. Forgive me. I wasn't tracking. Well, working shoulder to shoulder with her, I mean, we've seen Madalyn Murray O'Hair at her best and worst. Obviously, a complex and flawed character.
Oh, yes.
She's a human being who often led with what some might call, what I have in my life occasionally called toxicity. She'll just go in and she'll steamroll right over you. So I don't know how else to ask the question, Frank, but was she an asshole?
That's used as a term of art, I assume.
What was she like? I mean, was she compassionate? Did she?
Most of the time in private, again, basically she became a surrogate mother for both my wife and me. I had lost my actual mother just 2 years before I met Madalyn. 1 year before I met Madalyn. And Madalyn, I think, liked me a lot, but she liked my wife a lot more than she liked me. But in private, I mean, she was in our house here in Ohio. We were in her house many times in Austin. We were family. Now, she was very volatile, and John Garth was very volatile. Robin, who was my daughter's age, approximately, was much more tranquil, and she would be a peacemaker. But the tensions under which everybody had to operate day after day were really quite excessive, Seth. And when you would be working down there as a volunteer, which I did a number of times, and you'd hear Madalyn and John Garth railing against each other, you think, oh, my God, they're going to kill each other,
Wow.
And then at 11 o'clock, everybody would say, okay, let's go to Fuddruckers and get something to eat.
They just put that compartment back here and then
it was like
move on.
nothing had ever happened. But, if you had been a little fly on the wall and didn't know anything more, you would think, oh, my goodness, we're about to witness fratricide or matricide or whatever the term for killing your son is.
I mean, in some exchanges, Frank, she seemed so together. She was measured. I mean, when I see her sitting across from William F. Buckley or even Phil Donahue or in so many interviews, she's pretty together. But at the same time, there seems to just sort of emanate from her a contempt for religion. And it also, she seemed to thrive on all the venom that was tossed at her. The more they hated her, the more motivated she was. Is that accurate?
Well, yes, that's true, but I guess it's just part of the story. Madalyn, very early on, and she told me this in detail, very early on, she realized that if she was going to be a nice girl, no one would pay any attention to her whatsoever. Her message would be completely lost. And, certainly there were lots of atheist philosophers in every university in America who probably were, from a theoretical and philosophical point of view, more deeply atheistic than even Madalyn was. But you never heard of any one of them. And she knew that, and she was very bitter about that, the sexism that she experienced. And she realized that unless she made a ruckus of some sort, nobody would pay any attention. And she was the one who really created Donahue's career in television. She inaugurated his very first program, and he just went right off the charts immediately because she was, by standards of the time, she was outrageous. And not that what she said wasn't true, but she was outrageous in violating the politeness rules that deferred to religion so much in those years. And by the way, Seth, this continued even after Madalyn's time. Many years later, when Sally Jesse Raphael was about to go national by the same producers that did Donahue, they called Madalyn to have her initiate Sally as well. And I don't know, Madalyn and Donahue were kind of down at the time. I don't know what the details were. Donahue was kind of confused. He didn't know why she was mad at him. But she told them, well, go get Frank Zindler. Let Frank Zindler do it. And they said, who? And so she gave them my phone number and so on. And so they called me. And so when I then initiated Sally Jesse Raphael in her first nationally syndicated program, it was the same kind of thing. And I had to be not as outrageous as Madalyn, but I really had to be pretty, well, I don't know the word for it, but anyway.
Sure,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, by whispering under your breath, you're not going to be getting much in terms of attention, right?
Yeah, you have to get their attention. And so part of her outrageous behavior was very consciously determined by that crucial factor. And so some of this kind of developed naturally because she got all that hate mail because of the court decision. And so she kind of turned that to advantage.
When I come back with my special guest, Frank Zindler, associate of the late Madalyn Murray O'Hair and longtime affiliate of American Atheists, we're going to talk about this story that Madalyn Murray O'Hair and members of her family once attempted to defect to the USSR. Did Madalyn Murray O'Hair not want to be an American? What's that about? We're going to talk about her disappearance and murder in 1995 and the hugely problematic Netflix movie, which missed an opportunity to tell the true story of Madalyn Murray O'Hair. We're going to continue to separate the fact from the fiction, and we'll continue our conversation in just a second. Hang on. Today's broadcast is called The Most Hated Woman in America, as we profile the life of the late Madalyn Murray O'Hair. I'm speaking on the radio here with Frank Zindler, a former president of American Atheists, longtime associate. How many decades have you been involved with American Atheists, my friend?
Well, I joined her in 1976.
Is it true that Madalyn Murray O'Hair and Garth or John and was it Robin all wanted at one point to defect, to leave the United States, or was that earlier? I think Robin wasn't around yet.
Robin was on the scene yet. I think it was with both of her sons, John and Bill
That's
Jr.
right. That's right.
And they did indeed go to the Soviet Union. I never did learn much about the details. Of course, the Soviet Union was very famous or infamous at the time, as being an atheist nation. In fact, the Constitution of the Soviet Union said no such thing. It did not do that. It's simply that it totally disenfranchised the Russian Orthodox Church. But anyway, they did have organized atheism classes. In fact, I have a couple of Russian language textbooks on atheism.
Really?
But, dating from, I don't remember what their middle 20th century dates. But exactly what she was trying to do is not clear. It never was very clear to me. Part of it, of course, was pretty obvious. I mean, she was almost daily receiving death threats in America. She could not get a job. She was, well, as Life magazine called it, the most hated woman in America, which gave rise to the name of the film. And so, we'll try to get asylum in the Soviet Union. In that context, it seems plausible enough.
Well, of course, this plays right into the God and country, God and America crowd who thinks not only is she an atheist, here's proof that she's aligned herself with those evil communists over there kind of thing, right?
Exactly. And of course, the mottos in God We Trust and One Nation Under God, these were put on the money and the pledge and so on in the mid-50s as a conscious effort to equate atheism with communism and un-Americanism. And I myself then, as late as I think 1998 or 1999, was the last time that I did a radio or television interview where within the first three questions I was not asked, okay, Frank, you are an atheist. Now, are you also a communist? That didn't end until 98 or 99. And Madalyn had to fight that just a fortiori, much more powerfully and forcefully in the 60s and 70s.
It's interesting, Frank, that conversation continues today. What was the recent poll where a large percentage of American adults who are evangelicals believe that you must believe in God to be a true patriot or to be a true American? Those discussions continue even today.
Yeah, well, the right-wing religious groups have rewritten American history to turn this into historically a Christian nation, and that the founding fathers were not deists. They were good Presbyterians or Baptists or whatever.
Yeah. Well, that was news to me, right? I was raised, and they might as well have all been hand over heart, holding a Bible, waving the American and the Christian flag. That was the history taught to us. We just never questioned it. And it was such a surprise to learn the criticism and skepticism of people like Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and others, right?
Yeah, Thomas Paine and Jefferson in particular, and Benjamin Franklin, for goodness sake.
Yeah.
And, all of those people knew the value of language and the power of words. And so when they needed to rally the nation behind them, or the nation to be behind them, they could use religious language. But the point that most people don't realize was that in many of the cases, these religious words, creator, etc., were used in the deistic sense, not the Orthodox Christian sense. And there are so many books, I think, was it Barton or Barlow? I've heard something, he's been writing all these pseudo-history books about American history. But it's really difficult, and you cannot really get an objective American history course taught in a public school. And certainly you can't get it taught in a private school.
Yeah. Back to the fact and fiction of the Netflix film The Most Hated Woman in America. Yeah. It's presented like the eldest son, William, who ultimately rejected atheism and embraced Jesus Christ and became an evangelical Christian. It's sort of presented that he in his own life was struggling in terms of identity. He was always doing his mom's good work. He was never allowed to be his own person. He was always in her shadow, and that may have fed into his rejection of atheism. I don't know how much of that is fact or fiction. It's really, impossible probably to know completely what's in the man's heart. But it is true that in, 1980, he came forward and said that he was a believer, and churches everywhere rejoiced.
Yeah, the story there is extremely complex. I can't go into many details for legal reasons as well as other reasons. But basically, I would say that Bill was basically forced into getting religion. His written accounts of his conversion do not hold together. The depiction in the film of his getting religion at AA, that's completely nonsense. But when I met him, I forget what the year was, he already had spent almost a year touring the country, violating which commandment is it about honor thy mother and father? He was making a really good living already, slandering his mother. And I talked to him for a few moments privately. And I said, well, now, Bill, now that you've gone back to Jesus, are you going to go back to the Easter Bunny too? And he had a completely atheistic reflex to that, okay? And and he was kind of chortling, until he looked around and he saw these little Mennonite ladies standing there looking really horrified and puzzled. And at that point, you have to realize he's a very big man and he wears cowboy boots. So he was towering over me, and I was 6'3" at the time. But at that point, he backs away from me and shouts so that everybody can hear, "Get away from me, you have AIDS. Don't touch me."
You have AIDS?
Yeah, that's what he shouted at me.
There is a quote attributed to Madalyn Murray O'Hair about her son. She called him, after the fact, after his conversion, reportedly called him a postnatal abortion and cut him off completely. I don't know. Does this ring true to you? Do you have any...
I don't know. It's conceivable. Madalyn never got over the fact that he defected, if you want to use that term. She knew as well as I did that Bill was being coerced by some other third force to do that. And my wife, Anne, tried to reason with Madalyn and said, look, Madalyn, even in his ghost-written book, My Life Without God, he's actually sending you a signal. And Madalyn was just so hurt she could not look at this in the way we thought was an objective view. So, yeah, Madalyn was really, really hurt by his turn away from her. And she did then just absolutely slam the door.
Did she have, in your opinion, and you can share as much as you're comfortable with, do you feel like she had emotional problems?
Well, in a sense, yes. She was a brittle diabetic, and you could see her emotional condition change somewhat in the course of a day. And we never quite could figure out whether it was low blood sugar or high blood sugar or both, but she would be much more volatile at certain times in the day, depending upon when they'd eaten and not eaten and things like that. And usually everything would just blow over. But if that happened when she was in a public place, very often her outbursts, they created an irreversible situation. There was, okay, that's it. I've said it, and now we do that. We go with it. But in private, you could see these ups and downs as well. Madalyn was a very, very bright woman. She was very talented. I mentioned that she had been a musician. The very first time I ever visited her home in Austin, we were ushered into one of the parlors, and I saw this little spinet piano, and I said, Madalyn, who plays the piano? And she says, well, I used to. And then I said, do you mind if I try it out? And she says, no, go ahead. And I said, well, do you have any music? She says, well, yeah, in the piano bench. So I opened up the piano bench, and here right on the top was a yellow smudged copy of the Schirmer edition of the Chopin Etudes, which are the devilishly most difficult things that Chopin wrote. And I opened it up to the so-called revolutionary etude, which I had been trying to play. And I looked at the thing, and it was all marked up with fingerings and phrasings and stuff like this in pencil, and the pages were dog-eared, and it looked like that piece had just gone through the war. And I said, Madalyn, who was playing the Revolutionary Etude? She said, oh, I used to play that. And I said, well, why don't you anymore? She said, well, when the police broke my wrist, when they invaded our home in Baltimore, that ended my piano playing. I can't even begin to imagine, Seth, how enduring a bitterness that must have created in Madalyn. I can't imagine my own self, for whom music means so much, being prevented for the rest of my life from expressing myself musically, especially if I had had the ability that she had. And so there were just so many things about her life that are tragic in maybe the Greek sense of the term. But she was a flawed character. There's no doubt about it. She had to make decisions often with less than adequate information. Several times she would get really peeved at me because she thought I was doing this or that and did not have all the data. And then I'd have to try to straighten it out.
Would you consider yourself close? Were you guys tight?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. As I said, Ann and I really felt that we were part of the family.
Talking here with Frank Zindler, editor of American Atheist Press, 40-year associate of the organization American Atheist, and once friend of Madalyn Murray O'Hair. Let's go back to 1995. There's a note on the door at the office that they have gone on a trip. They don't know when they're coming back. Things start to look suspicious, right? There's food on the table. The dogs, who I guess Madalyn dearly loved, were left unattended.
The dogs were in the backyard, and the backyard could be penned in, and the dogs were there. And Spike Tyson discovered the dogs, and that was alarming.
So you were already seeing the red flags in your own life. You're thinking, hey, Madalyn wouldn't do this. That's what you're thinking.
The thing was, it was extremely hard to understand what had happened. Some of us thought that, something really bad had happened, which indeed was the case. However, there was also the possibility that they had to leave very suddenly. The dogs had been in the backyard, but then they disappeared, and they were in a kennel, being boarded in a kennel. I forgot about that detail.
Now, that wasn't in the film.
So the fact that the dogs were not running loose, even though they had been in the backyard, but then one day later they were in a boarding kennel, made some people on the board think, well, maybe they have rushed away somewhere. Maybe somebody has a will or property or something like that is in jeopardy, that they willed it to American Atheists. By the way, again and again over the years, people would will lots of money to American Atheists and property, houses and land and all sorts of stuff. Only then the will would be contested by family or whatever. And then the decedent judged non compos mentis that he obviously was out of his mind if he was leaving anything to an atheist organization, and we would lose the whole thing. And so it was very plausible. It turned out to be false, but it was very plausible that they might have, flown out, say, to Oregon or Washington State or something to be present at the point to guard a possible property or something. In fact, there was a will that we did know of. We couldn't find it at the time, but there was a will that involved a large amount of property and buildings and so on. We didn't know where it was. We just vaguely knew that it existed. And so many members of the board thought that was what was going on and that they would be back. And so Ellen Johnson took over as temporary pro tempore president. And, of course, as time wore on, she assumed the full legal responsibility of president.
Frank, were you privy to any of the phone calls that came in from Madalyn or John or Robin?
No. I did try to call Madalyn on her cell phone, and no one answered. And Ellen pretty much coordinated the whole research. She hired a detective and so on, and we tried to find out what was going on. we didn't want to mess up a deal if indeed there was a will. On the other hand, we desperately needed to know that they were all right. And Ellen did talk to Robin. Probably it was the last conversation Robin had. Said, "Are you all right?" And Robin said, "Yes, and you'll know what to do." And that was the end of that. And that was the last conversation anybody on the outside had that we know of with Robin. And that didn't sound right to Ellen, but at the same time, there were just so many possibilities. I've only mentioned two, but it really was very worrisome. We did trace them to that motel or that hotel in San Antonio and the pharmacy where Madalyn got some more insulin. So a lot of the stuff we had figured out, thanks to Ellen's work, but we just couldn't put the pieces together.
There's a scene in the Netflix film where David Waters is talking to Madalyn Murray O'Hair, and she's like, "Don't you know who I am? You know, everyone's going to be looking for me." And he looked her in the eye and said, "No one is going to be looking for you." And I want to speak to the culture of the time where she was so cast off and so hated, and she'd pitted herself against the culture in so many ways. Do you sense, or did you sense, a lack of enthusiasm by those who were charged to investigate her disappearance?
Certainly not with regard to those in the organization, but the police and so on refused to do anything. When David Waters had stolen everything from the center, the police chief would not arrest him, even though Madalyn had all the evidence showing, his signatures on checks and things like that. They would not arrest what they thought was a good Christian man on the charge of a hated atheist woman. And basically, the police declared open season on atheists at that point. And I think that further emboldened Waters and his ex-con companions to go through with the kidnapping.
So the narrative then is, according to the film, that they were going to grab all this money from these offshore accounts and they used it to buy gold coins. Can you help me separate the truth from the fiction here?
Well, as I said, they were operating with the idea from the vicious rumors that Madalyn had multiple offshore accounts. And they did not know that the New Zealand account was the trust fund. And so they kidnapped her. I mean, the trust fund could not be touched without a signature from an officer, and it had to go through a bank in New Jersey. And so it's still not quite clear who flew with John Garth to New Jersey to that bank so that John could sign on the dotted line to have the money exported from New Zealand to the rare coin dealer, gold coin dealer in San Antonio. But, of course, the thing is, John had to be on best behavior because both Madalyn and Robin were being held hostage somewhere back in Texas. Yeah. So the coins were, well, the dealer could not, he didn't have enough gold coins on hand to fill the entire amount of money that was being sent, that had been sent. And so when John went to get the money, and again, Madalyn and Robin were being held hostage, he filled a suitcase with gold coins. I don't know how much that must have weighed, but they lacked $200,000. They could not, they said, you'll have to come back next week. And of course, that was not going to work. They almost surely killed everybody that same day and simply took the coins that John had gotten. They sold John's car. Robin's car mysteriously was still in parking in an airport garage. We don't know what in the world that was all about. The coins were stored in a storage locker. I don't think it was the same place where they dismembered the bodies, but they got to a tavern to celebrate, and one of the guys, oh dear me, his name just flies out of my memory. He was from Florida, Danny Fry. Danny Fry got kind of tipsy, apparently, and loud. And they were in a large booth in this bar, and right over the back of the booth was another booth with these hoodlums, petty thieves or whatever, and they overheard Danny Fry bragging about what had been done, or the money, And he must have said some things that they knew where it was, or that they knew, which storage place it was. So everybody went back after that to the motel, and the hoodlums went and started rifling the storage lockers. And apparently one of the very first ones they tried was the one with all the coins. So they made off with all the coins. They blew all the money on prostitutes and gambling in Las Vegas, and there was nothing left of it. And
so after all that, David Waters didn't get any of the money anyway.
Right, yeah, exactly.
They were missing persons, though, not murder victims, for many years until the bodies were discovered.
Yeah, it was over 5 years. It was 5 years. That was thanks to several newspaper reporters who put it all together. But Danny Fry was murdered because of his loud mouth. They beheaded him and cut off his hands so they couldn't be identified. They found his nude, headless, handless body on the banks of what is the river there in Dallas. His head and hands were later found in the grave, the shallow grave on that ranch outside of San Antonio. Speaking of graves, one of the things that is perhaps the most ignominious about the film is at the end they have Bill Murray having the ashes of Madalyn, Garth, and Robin placed in the columbarium in the mausoleum at the Onion Creek Cemetery, where in fact their remains are being kept in Onion Creek Cemetery just outside of Austin. But they are not in that columbarium. They were buried in an unmarked grave, and Bill Murray forbade the caretaker to let anybody know where the grave was. So it is an unmarked grave. He didn't want anybody to be able to honor the memory of his mother and brother and daughter. So to this day, there is no marker on the spot. Fortunately, one of the FBI agents intimately involved in the case showed Ellen Johnson and the treasurer of American Atheists, Dick Hogan at that time, where the spot was, and then several years after that, they showed me. But at this time, the caretaker of the cemetery will not tell anybody where it is located. He won't confirm that we have the right spot. It's sort of the final ignominy of this whole sad case.
One thing I will say that the film got right, or appeared to get right, and you can confirm, was that the Madalyn Murray O'Hair of the screen and of real life, she obviously held religion in contempt. She called it insanity and whatnot. But her fight wasn't against the personal freedom to be religious. Time and again, it was like, it's a church-state fight. It's a boundary fight. This is about you not imposing your religion. And so there's this false narrative that has been pitched for so many decades, and it was taught to us as young people in Christian school, that she wanted to kill prayer in public, prayer in school, whatnot. But the truth is that she was only against the violation of the Constitution and the church-state line. She was probably an advocate for those who could freely pray personally, and that was the difference.
Absolutely. I could not have said it better, Seth. And privately, she would say, people have a right to be crazy.
I think she said it publicly a few times,
Maybe
Frank.
she did. I don't know. But quite really, she said, you are entitled to your religion, and I am entitled to my non-religion. You are not entitled to impose your religion upon me, nor am I entitled to impose my non-religion upon you. And that the wall of separation between state and church that is implied in the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States basically says just that. And she was just putting extra words into explaining the First Amendment.
Do you have any final thoughts as we cap the conversation here? And is there a resource that people can find where they can learn the facts about her life, a documentary film or a book or something you might recommend?
Yeah. Ironically, it's a book with the same title. It's called America's Most Hated Woman. And the author is Ann Rowe Seaman. That's Ann, A-N-N, and Rowe, R-O-W-E, and Seaman, S-E-A-M-A-N. The subtitle of America's Most Hated Woman is The Life and Gruesome Death of Madalyn Murray O'Hair. Ann Seaman did some amazing research. She found all kinds of stuff that I had never known. I was very impressed with her research. And she interviewed my wife, Ann, and me at some length, too, in producing that book. But it really is a very even-handed thing. I mean, she shows the warts and whatnot, too. But I think it's a very even-handed biography.
Frank, did Madalyn Murray O'Hair change the culture? Was she a game changer?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I want to weep at times to think when I see all of the thriving atheist open groups now, young people here at the university and things like that, that are just openly atheists, and it's no big deal. If only Madalyn could have lived to see this. But she was the trailblazer. And because, well, one of the things that I have to tell you about Madalyn is she wanted to desensitize the culture to the A word. She wanted to use the word atheist wherever possible so that people would become desensitized to it, that they would not have this horror of a word which should have no horror associated with it. Incidentally, this was also part of her philosophy about dirty words. She said there is no such thing as a dirty word. There is nothing magical about words. There are no blessings. There are no curses. These four-letter words are nothing more than four-letter words. They're just words. And we should desensitize people to this, that we should look at the meanings of the words and not at the sound of the words. And so she was, notorious for having had a foul mouth, although I must say the film goes way beyond anything I ever heard Madalyn say.
Yeah, she was more of a strategist with language, I think, than the film lays out.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the perfect term, yes, a strategist.
It's amazing how my own perceptions have changed. While I do see her as a flawed character, I have come to, in many ways, admire her for what she accomplished and how she was a trailblazer for the activism that we do today. I, in many ways, admire the life and legacy of Madalyn Murray O'Hair. Would I have done everything the way she did it? Absolutely not. But in so many ways, I think, she was fearless and she was honest and she went out and did battle even when it was hugely unpopular and in many ways paid an ultimate price for it. And I have to respect that. So.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And that sums it up very nicely.
Do you have any final thoughts on Madalyn before we wrap it up here? Anything personally that resonates with you?
Only that, it was a real honor for me to have been able to have been associated with her and to have fought the fight with her during many of those crucial years, although the years that she spent before I met her were far and away more difficult and requiring more heroic activity than those in the subsequent years. But even so, it has been a real honor for me to have been able to, just to have my name in a book that is about Madalyn Murray O'Hair. This is a real honor.
Frank Zindler, thank you so much for giving up an hour of your time to sort of help us discover the real Madalyn Murray O'Hair, to separate the fact from the fiction and to understand more about the life and legacy of this atheist activist. And thanks for your own great work and for all that you're doing out there and for being a part of the broadcast. So appreciated, sir.
It's been a real pleasure, and thank you so much.
And that's the broadcast today. Coming up next Tuesday, I'm doing a show called Does Religion Poison Everything? And of course, I'm borrowing from the subtitle of Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great. What's your perspective on religion? Is there any instance where religion is beneficial and helpful and necessary and should not be removed from the equation, lest the equation become less? We're going to talk about religion. Does it poison everything? Next week, and I will see you then.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter. Watch dozens of original videos on the Thinking Atheist YouTube channel. And visit our website for resources, links, contact information, the editor's blog, and more. thethinkingatheist.com.